haircut?
I did.
Like the haircut.
Thanks. All right. Pull up the notes I sent out this morning. I want to finish up the chapter. So tomorrow we'll review. Thursday we'll test. All right. So this was the last slide when we meet Wednesday. All right. So don't type this out because you should already have this. All right. It's on your notes from Wednesday. And I'm not gonna. I can't expect you guys to remember what we were talking about on Wednesday. I mean, we had a break. I'm sure some of you guys were out helping paint, snipping glue, whatever you guys do, it's none of my business, all right? But we were, and again, when I say we, Scott, it's like basically me talking, you trying to stay awake, and I want to include you in the experience every once in a while, looking up from your phone, going, oh, okay. And I appreciate that. But we were talking about the 100 Years' War, right? Which is really like off and on, like, it's a series of like 3 wars. It was about 116 years, but remember the 116-year war is not stupid. All right, but there is a question on the test, and that question is, well, there's more than one question, but one of the questions on the test. The 100 Years' War was a series of wars fought mainly between what 2 nations? I made that up right on the spot. Oh, what's the answer? Does anybody know? France and England. France and England. All right, so you guys probably weren't sniffing like a little bit. All right. So, and it's mainly over the issue, who is the rightful heir to the French crown? Now, the issue dates back to the time when William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, became the King of France, right? The Norman invasion. So, as Duke of Normandy, he was vassal to the King of France, right? So that sets the pattern for when the kings of England are essentially the vassals to the kings of France. Also, too, what ends up happening is that in England and France tend to kind of fight frequently. A lot of times, it wasn't just them. Other nations and feudal states would do this. To solidify a treaty, they would marry off sons and daughters. It was kind of like an insurance policy. So the first phase of the 100 Years' War is named the Edwardian War, named after Edward III. Edward's mother was Isabella of France. She was the daughter of Philip the Fair. All right. So when Philip the Fair dies, his son Charles IV becomes king. Charles doesn't have a male heir to become king. So they pass it on to a cousin who becomes John II. The deal is that Edward was like, I'm closer to the crown than John is. My mother was the daughter of the King of France. My grandfather was the King of France. So he essentially invaded France to basically lay that claim. All right. So the first phase, the Edwardian War, is English victories. Right. The second phase is Caroline War, where France regains a lot of territory. All right, named after Charles V, who was essentially the King of France that started that. Restarted. The third phase, the Lancastrian phase, starts out with English victories. Right, this is under Henry V. Also, too, the English had a weapon that was a distinct advantage. You remember what that weapon was?
Yeah.
Crossbow, the longbow. Close, yeah, the longbow. So the longbow was kind of like the cannon was introduced in the first phase, the Battle of Crecy, but it didn't make a big impact, but you got to start somewhere. The longbow, like I said, was like a machine gun on the stick, right? And so that's why when like English longbowmen were captured in battle, the French would cut off their first 2 fingers so they couldn't pluck them back. So the Battle of Agincourt, which was a major battle in the Lancastrian War, that was when the French were retreating, the English longbowmen were giving them the forks. They're basically saying, we still have our 2 fingers. And then eventually over time, that basically we see that this finger gets dropped, and then that's where the legend of kind of middle finger. This is day 2 of me getting to put you guys wrong, all within the realm of history. We don't know if that's true or not, but it's a great story. Right? So the first phase looks like basically England's going to regain its territory. Henry V marries Charles VI, Charles the Mad's daughter, Catherine Valois, and that basically Treaty of Troyes essentially states that their children, their heir, will be also the King of England, King of France. However, there was already in the name given to the kind of the heir to the French throne was Dauphin. There was already a guy, Charles VII. He basically was like, hey, when am I chopped liver? And so there were some people that basically kind of threw their support with him. The English were basically just going back into France, to southern France, to spank them and basically kind of kill them and would do whatever. However, who emerges? A young peasant girl that changes the trajectory of that war. Do you remember her name? Joan of Arc. All right, Joan of Arc is the Latin figure in history that's going to change the tide of the war. And as a result, France wins the 100 Years' War, so to speak. In a bigger picture, like I said, we start to see a lot of historians credit the Black Death and the 100 Years' War at the beginning and the end of the kind of concept of feudalism in that sense, where we have basically sometimes kings going over the heads of vassals to acquire basically professional standing armies. The idea, particularly of kind of having a knighted cavalry as a distinct advantage, is somewhat diminished with the longbow and stuff. And also, we start to see kind of like basically kind of kings looking more towards right, kind of the middle class, the bourgeoisie in France, as a means of kind of strengthening their position in monarchy. So France is on the ascension. All right. As a result, Charles VII, who like at the beginning of that kind of his reign, pretty weak. By the end, thanks to Joan of Arc and then the French victories, and kind of forcing the English out of France, all except this area called Calais on the northern part. And also in England, what that does, it basically has language. French was the common language of the court. You know, that dates back to kind of like William the Conqueror. Like somebody like Richard the Lionheart, Richard I barely could speak any English, right? It's mainly French was the main language. We start to see that change, and English becomes the language of the court. In France, Charles VII basically has to raise money to kind of pay for what the war kind of cost. So he initiates two taxes. He was only able to do this being a strong monarch. One was a property tax called taille, which was kind of a punitive tax against particularly certain nobles who sided with the English at certain parts of the war. And the other one was called gapelle, which is a tax on salt. And why is salt so important? Keep preservation of food. All right. And so he was able to do this because he kind of had a strong foundation. Now he is going to pass this foundation on to his son, Louis XI, who, although they did not have a great relationship, according to some historians, Louis was somebody kind of critical of his father. He benefits from his father's kind of like a strong monarchy. All right. Now Louis is often referred in history as the Spider King, mainly because he kind of casts a lot of webs of intrigue. One thing that he was known to do was basically pit nobles against one another. All right. Creating rumors and things of that nature, sending out spies. So knowing that he could pit them against each other, knowing that they'd be more concerned with each other than basically his reign, was able to kind of deflect some kind of heat against them. Also in England, we'll talk about England's going through a civil war. He gets involved in that through financing certain sides of that civil war. So Louis is this kind of figure that is going to kind of be aware of everything that's going on in France. All right, so here we find the monarchs at this time are stronger than their vassals, primarily. This is a painting of Louis in the middle there. He's rocking like this white guy, like perm from the 70s. It looks like a sticks. And so all of the guys that are around him are basically him. Now, that doesn't mean his court, he had to have people that were doppelgangers. The artist here is indicating that he is everywhere, that he knows what's going on. All right, and like I said, he had his hands in numerous intrigues and things of that nature. Right. This is a portrait. It's not a very flattering portrait of Louis, in my opinion. Matter of fact, they're very distinct on the number of chins that my man has. It's what he looked like, they believe. So, yeah, so it's not very flattering, but being king, you don't necessarily have to be good looking. Now, in England, England's going through a major transition. This transition plays out in a civil war referred to as the War or Wars of the Roses. All right, it's about a 30-year period off and on, basically to determine who is the basically rightful king of England. Now, a lot of this is based on the fact that the kind of the losses of the 100 Years' War were pretty dramatic. So what you have here is the kind of the royal family in England at this time is under a larger kind of umbrella referred to as the House of Plantagenet. This dates back to kind of William the Conqueror. But within that, you have sub houses that are like cousins. All right. And so the House of Lancaster at the time was basically that was the kind of the like Henry V, who we talked about. That's why they refer to Lancaster. Were in power. All right. However, a kind of sub-faction of that family, the group of cousins, the House of York, threatened to take over. Yeah.
But at this time, didn't they have like a parliament? Or did they not?
There is a model parliament. Yes, there is a model.
They don't have like as much power to tell them to chill out.
Right, and this is yeah. So what you have here is you have a lot of like basically this. You can have an entire college course on this. There's courses strictly just on the War of the Roses. Right, it's shifting alliances. There's sides like trying to be people like like there's people that overthrow kings. There's people that basically kind of usurp power and such. It's referred to as, and at the time they didn't refer to as the War of the Roses. That is first used in Shakespeare. Shakespeare, a lot of the things that we have associated with this era in history actually come from Shakespeare. All right, Shakespeare wrote about Henry V and the whole St. Crispin's Day speech and stuff like that. But it's named after that because both houses, their heraldry, their symbols were roses. All right, so you had the red rose of Lancaster and then the white rose of York. All right, so like I said, this is incredibly complicated. But have you ever seen Game of Thrones? Has anyone ever seen Game of Thrones? All right. Some people believe that the War of the Roses kind of laid kind of like some inspiration down for the Game of Thrones. So I'm going to play this video that talks about the various kind of like intrigues and shifting alliances that make up the War of the Roses. All right.
As far as we know, medieval England was never invaded by ice zombies or terrorized by dragons, but it was shaken by a power struggle between two noble families, spanning generations and involving a massive cast of characters with complex motives and shifting loyalties. If that sounds familiar, it's because the historical conflicts known as the Wars of the Roses served as the basis for much of the drama in Game of Thrones. The real-life seeds of war were sown by the death of King Edward III in 1377. Edward's oldest son had died before his father, but his 10-year-old son, Richard II, succeeded to the throne ahead of Edward's 3 surviving sons. This skipping of an entire generation left lingering claims to the throne among their various offspring, particularly the Lancasters, descended from Edward's 3rd son, and the Yorks descended from his 4th son. The name of the ensuing wars comes from the symbols associated with the two families, the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster. The Lancasters first gained the throne when Richard II was deposed by his cousin Henry IV in 1399. Despite sporadic unrest, their reign remained secure until 1422, when Henry V's death in a military campaign left an infant Henry VI as king. Weak-willed and dominated by advisors, Henry was eventually convinced to marry Margaret of Anjou to gain French support. Margaret was beautiful, ambitious, and ruthless in persecuting any threat to her power, and she distrusted Richard of York most of all. York had been the king's close advisor and loyal general, but was increasingly sidelined by the queen, who promoted her favorite supporters like the Earls of Suffolk and Somerset. York's criticism of their continuing of the war against France led to his exclusion from court and transfer to Ireland. Meanwhile, mounting military failures and corrupt rule by Margaret and her allies caused widespread discontent. And in the midst of this chaos, Richard of York returned with an army to arrest Somerset and reform the court. Initially unsuccessful, he soon got his chance when he was appointed protector of the realm after Henry suffered a mental breakdown. However, less than a year later, Henry suddenly recovered, and the queen convinced him to reverse York's reforms. York fled and raised an army once more. Though he was unable to directly seize the throne, he managed to be reinstated as protector and have himself and his heirs designated to succeed Henry. But instead of a crown, York's head acquired a pipe after he was killed in battle with the queen's loyalists. His young son took up the claim and was crowned Edward IV. Edward enjoyed great military success against the Lancasters. Henry was captured, while Margaret fled into exile with their reportedly cruel son, Edward of Westminster. But the newly crowned king made a tragic political mistake by backing out of his arranged marriage with a French princess to secretly marry the widow of a minor noble. This alienated his most powerful ally, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick allied with the Lancasters, turned Edward's jealous younger brother George against him, and even briefly managed to restore Henry as king. But it didn't last. Edward recaptured the throne. The Lancaster prince was killed in battle, and Henry himself died in captivity not long after. The rest of Edward IV's reign was peaceful, but upon his death in 1483, the bloodshed resumed. Though his 12-year-old son was due to succeed him, Edward's younger brother Richard III declared his nephews illegitimate, due to their father's secret marriage. He assumed the regency himself and threw the boys in prison. Though no one knows what ultimately became of them, after a while the princes disappeared, and Richard's power seemed secure. But his downfall would come only 2 years later, from across the narrow sea of the English Channel. Henry Tudor was a direct descendant of the first Duke of Lancaster, raised in exile after his father's death in a previous rebellion. With Richard III's power grab causing a split in the York faction, Henry won support for his royal claim. Raising an army in France, he crossed the Channel in 1485 and quickly defeated Richard's forces. And by marrying Elizabeth of York, elder sister of the disappeared princes, the newly crowned Henry VII joined the Two Roses, finally ending nearly a century of war. We often think of historical wars as decisive conflicts with clearly defined winners and losers. But the Wars of the Roses, like the fiction they inspire, show us that victories can be uncertain, alliances unstable, and even the power of kings as fleeting as they seem.
All right, so the video, as you mentioned, is the kind of the official end of the War of the Roses. Takes place at a battle close to what is now Leicester, called the Battle of Bosworth Field. All right, there, Richard III, who's mentioned in the video, is one of the more vilified kind of kings, dies in battle. All right, and according to Shakespeare, Richard had a hunchback and kind of is kind of portrayed as this kind of scheming, kind of conniving kind of individual. About 7 years ago, they believe they found his remains under what they call a car park, what we call a parking lot, like kind of close to where the battle was. And there's some indication that he may have suffered like from his bones, as he may have suffered from something like a hunchback there. All right, but at this time, the Lancasters essentially have kind of given way to a kind of subsect of that line of the family called the Tudors. All right, who like through the help of kind of Louis XI are going to basically kind of able to kind of organize in France and defeat the Yorks. All right, and so Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII. All right, he ends up marrying Richard's sister, basically kind of bringing the two families back together. All right, combining them into what they call the Tudor Rose, which is the red and white rose. Now, Henry VII is probably more famous, as we know, as the father to Henry VIII, who we'll talk about next chapter, who is essentially the King of England, who is famous for having 6 wives and basically having 3 of them beheaded, and breaks off with the Catholic Church. All right, so there's Henry. All right, and that's the Tudor Rose. All right, so England has to go through this transition while kind of France is on the ascension a little bit. All right, and then with this, the Tudors are going to be one of the more shorter kind of lived dynasty, but one of the more stronger ones as well. Now, in other parts of Europe, for example, in Spain is kind of going through a kind of unification, if you will. We talked about kind of Castile kind of getting involved in the second phase of the Caroline War. Spain was going through something called Reconquista, dating back to the 700s. So in chapter 6, I talked about kind of how Islam made its way on the Iberian Peninsula with the Moors, which were a mix of Arabs and Berbers from North Africa. They established like cities like Cordoba. Like in southern Spain, they refer to as Andalusia. That comes from the kind of the Muslim rule in that area. Almost immediately, we find, like in Spain, it's not unified at this time. It's basically made up of various feudal states, Navarre, Leon, but the two big ones are Castile and Aragon, which are basically tied to the Catholic Church. All right, so the Reconquista is from a Christian perspective here. All right, and at one point in the 1480s, the heirs to their respective thrones in Castile and Aragon married. That's Isabel and Ferdinand. Now, they married actually at night. They did not have the kind of approval of their families. However, their marriage basically brings the two states together. This is a marriage of relative political expediency. However, these are two monarchs that are mentioned in the same breath. This is kind of one of these eras where they're pretty much equals, which is something you don't usually kind of find in kind of monarchies at this time. All right. This is an image of Isabella as a young girl. This is Ferdinand, a little bit older, and this is their wedding portrait. Doesn't look very kind of pleasant, but again, they kind of married under they weren't approval of their family, but they had a longer vision. All right, and their marriage essentially accelerates the Reconquista. All right, so what occurs here is the last Muslim stronghold, the Kingdom of Granada, and there's the city of Granada today that has a kind of a massive kind of complex called the Alhambra. Falls to the combined forces of Isabel and Ferdinand in 1492. Again, 1492 is a rather eventful year in Spain. It basically kind of fulfills the Reconquista, and what also happened in 1492. Columbus. And then Isabel and Ferdinand were the ones who basically financed Columbus's journey to the New World. All right. Now, there was something as the kind of the Christian state started to basically kind of conquer more Muslim-held territory, we start to see the reemergence of the Inquisition, which I talked about earlier in the chapter, which was the kind of office within the papacy that basically rooted out heresy, anybody who kind of went against kind of Catholic Church teachings. Here we see this tied in with Spanish nationalism. So what we have here in Spain, for about 700 years, we have this kind of coexistence between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. All right. Sometimes that coexistence is rather peaceful. Other times we have kind of religious intolerance and violence and stuff like that. All right. So after Isabel and Ferdinand basically kind of like defeat Granada, they essentially kind of, even before, as they kind of make their way into areas, they gave people an option to convert to Christianity. Right. If you did not, you were basically kind of like tortured. You were basically kind of expelled and such. And so the Spanish Inquisition dealt with what they called conversos, which were Jews who converted to Christianity, and Macaros, who were basically Moors, all right, Muslims that converted. Now, the deal is that this idea of insincere converts, all it really took was one person to make an accusation, all right? So let's say me and Faith we're business partners, and let's say we have a falling out. And Faith happens to be a converso. She converted from Judaism to Christianity, Catholicism. I can go to the office of the Inquisition and basically say, hey, Faith, well, I was at her home and she has a menorah. I think she's still practicing her own religion. All right. And she can be brought in front of the tribunal, which was mainly judged by Dominican monks and friars or Franciscans. And so what they would do is they would basically try to get a confession out of her. Unfortunately, a lot of these confessions were extracted through what we call enhanced interrogation, i.e. torture. So things like that were in the news some years ago, you guys are probably too young to remember, waterboarding. That has its origins with the Spanish Inquisition, all right? So the deal is that you have a number of people who basically could admit to things that they weren't necessarily kind of guilty of through torture, right? It lasts for about 350 years, all right? And so this is something that is kind of tied in with the kind of unification of Spain, all right? This is a painting of the Alhambra in the background being turned over by the Caliph Bobil Muhammad, I believe his name was Muhammad the 11th, to Ferdinand and Isabel. All right, and so according to the legend, as Bobil was kind of riding out and the Moors were basically eventually heading over to Morocco, he stops one last time to look at Alhambra. All right, and he kind of a tear runs down his face. All right, and according to the legend, his mother rides up next to him and says, "You would do well to weep like a woman what you cannot protect as a man." And then she rides off. That very spot in which Bobil looks back and sees Alhambra is called the last sigh of the Moor. Now, you may be asking yourself, I don't give a shit about your dumbass world history story. Fair enough. However, other people in the world are a little bit more concerned about this. So, Al-Qaeda, you guys, Osama bin Laden, one of the last recorded the speeches that he gave, talked about Al-Andalus, returning Al-Andalus to its rightful caliphate. All right. To groups like jihadists like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. This is an extension of the Crusades. These are Christians essentially basically taking over Muslim lands, and they want them back. That was one of the last speeches that he gave, was basically kind of taking back Al-Andalus for the Muslims. So like I said, history kind of doesn't die easy with certain parts of the world, certain people here. This is Alhambra, all right, the castle. I was there in 2001. It's incredibly impressive. There's a lot of fountains, gardens. It's just as impressive to me as Versailles was. All right, and there's a prime example of this kind of Arabesque type of architecture, if you will. All right, and so what I want to hear is to basically kind of show you this video that talks about the kind of ramifications of the Spanish.
It's 1481. In the city of Seville, devout Catholics are turning themselves in to the authority. They're confessing to heresy, failure to follow the beliefs of the Catholic Church. But why? The Spanish Inquisition has arrived in Seville. The Inquisition began in 1478 when Pope Sixtus IV issued a decree authorizing the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, to root out heresy in the Spanish kingdoms, a confederacy of semi-independent kingdoms in the area that would become the modern country of Spain. Though the order came from the church, the monarchs had requested it. When the Inquisition began, the Spanish kingdoms were diverse, both ethnically and religiously, with Jews, Muslims, and Christians living in the same regions. The Inquisition quickly turned its attention to ridding the region of people who were not part of the Catholic Church. It would last more than 350 years. On the ground, groups called tribunals ran the Inquisition in each region. Roles on a tribunal could include an arresting constable, a prosecuting attorney, inquisitors to question the accused, and a scribe. A Grand Inquisitor, a member of the clergy selected by the king and queen, almost always led a tribunal. The Inquisition marked its arrival in each new place with an Edict of Grace. Typically lasting 40 days, the Edict of Grace promised mercy to those who confessed to heresy. After that, the inquisitors persecuted suspected heretics on the basis of anonymous accusations. So the confessors in Seville probably didn't see themselves as actual heretics. Instead, they were hedging their bets by reporting themselves when the consequences were low, rather than risking imprisonment or torture if someone else accused them later on. They were right to worry. Once the authorities arrested someone, accusations were often vague, so the accused didn't know the reasons for their arrest or the identity of their accuser. Victims were imprisoned for months or even years. Once arrested, their property was confiscated, often leaving their families on the street. Under these conditions, victims confessed to the most mundane forms of heresy, like hanging linen to dry on a Saturday. The Inquisition targeted different subsets of the population over time. In 1492, at the brutal Grand Inquisitor Tomás de Torquemada's urging, the monarchs issued a decree giving Spanish Jews 4 months to either convert to Christianity or leave the kingdom. Thousands were expelled, and those who stayed risked persecution. Converts to Christianity, known as conversos, weren't even safe, because authorities suspected them of practicing Judaism in secret. The hatred directed at conversos was both religious and economic, as conversos made up a large portion of the upper middle class. The Inquisition eventually shifted its focus to the Moriscos, converts to Christianity from Islam. In 1609, an edict passed forcing all Moriscos to leave. An estimated 300,000 left. Those who remained became the Inquisition's next targets. The Inquisitors announced the punishments of those found guilty of heresy in public gatherings called autos de fe, or acts of faith. Hundreds of people gathered to watch the procession of sinners, mass, sermon, and finally the announcement of punishments. Most of the accused received punishments like imprisonment, exile, or having to wear a San Benito, a garment that marked them as a sinner. The worst punishment was relaxado en persona, a euphemism for burning at the stake. This punishment was relatively uncommon, reserved for unrepentant and relapsed heretics. Over 350 years after Queen Isabella started the Inquisition, her namesake, Queen Isabella II, formally ended it on July 15, 1834. The Spanish kingdom's dependence on the Catholic Church had isolated them, while the rest of Europe experienced the Enlightenment and embraced the separation of church and state. Historians still debate the number of people killed during the Inquisition. Some suggest over 30,000, but most estimate between 1,000 and 2,000. The consequences of the Inquisition, however, reach far beyond fatalities. In some places, an estimated 1/3 of prisoners were tortured. Hundreds of thousands of members of religious minorities were forced to leave their homes, and those who remained faced discrimination and economic hardship. Smaller inquisitions in Spanish colonial territories in the Americas, especially Mexico, carried their own tolls. Friends turned in friends. Neighbors accused neighbors, and even family members reported each other of heresy. Under the Inquisition, people were condemned to live in fear and paranoia for centuries. Trouble to
So the effects of the Inquisition. I have positive ones there. Well, I really should rephrase that. But what it does, it kind of accelerates kind of the unification of Spain. All right, we start to see, because as a result of basically kind of one nation kind of unified under kind of a Christian banner, if you will, we start to see the idea of becoming Spanish rather than kind of associated strictly with being Castile or Aragon or Navarre and places like that. Negative aspects, obviously, other than torture and death and stuff like that, but is the expulsion of Muslims and Jews does hurt the Spanish economy. Right, particularly with those within the Jewish population, where we see what they call Sephardic Jews. All right, they were kind of forced to leave. Anytime at this time, this happened in England and France, anytime the Jews were expelled from these countries, this is going to have an effect on the economy. And like the video said, it's going to last about 350 years, but the real heart of the kind of torture and stuff like that was right at the end of the Reconquista. All right, and then in Central and Eastern Europe, we have a transition, particularly with the Holy Roman Empire. We see the emergence of a family from Austria called the Habsburgs, sometimes spelled with P instead of a B, that inherit the kind of the throne for the Holy Roman Empire. All right, the Habsburgs, their kind of origins are Innsbruck, Vienna, in that area there. The Habsburgs are eventually going to have this tradition of marrying into all the other major royal families. So we're going to have, like, for example, Henry VIII, the Tudor king, his first wife is Catherine of Aragon. She is a Habsburg. All right. We're going to see the kind of Charles V, who's the king of Spain, and as well as the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Habsburgs had a tradition of basically kind of marrying into all these royal families, kind of making their inroads that way. All right. The first Habsburg to take the title Holy Roman Emperor is Frederick III. All right. Frederick is the Duke of Austria, basically, based on Vienna and Innsbruck there. He ends up marrying Eleanor of Portugal. At one point, Portugal and Spain unify, and then that makes their kind of their sons and essentially the kings of Spain as well as the Holy Roman Empire. We'll talk about Charles V in that particular case. This is his one of his wedding portraits. Now you can't tell right here. Later Habsburgs, because there's a lot of inbreeding, there's the development of something called the Habsburg chin or the Habsburg jaw. There's one Habsburg, Charles II of Spain. Look him up. He looks like a Picasso painting. All right. That was as a result of a lot of inbreeding. And then in Russia, we start to see the emergence of Moscow, and we start to see the shaping of what we consider modern Russia. That emerges with the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan III, aka Ivan the Great. All right. Now, Ivan will refer to himself as Tsar, but it's not until his grandson that is a term that's going to be used to represent the kind of leader of Russia. All right. He is going to overthrow the Mongols, the Golden Horde, refuse to pay tribute to the Tartars, who are basically the Mongols outsourced this to, as well as taking basically kind of power over like Novgorod and Kiev as a result. So that's why oftentimes they refer to him as Ivan the Great. All right. Ivan is the Russian name for John, basically. All right. And there's Ivan. The Russians are a little bit backwards, though, at this time. There's him kicking out the Golden Horde. And then one of the things that kind of solidifies they set the trajectory for centralized power and rule of those from Moscow is the establishment of something called the Subanet, which is basically this legal code that essentially creates centralized power in Russia. But like I said, Russia's backwards. Russia's going to be the last European country that does away with serfdom and things like that. All right. Okay, so that's chapter 10 in a nutshell. Like I said, tomorrow we will we'll review, and then on Thursday we will test. All right, sound good?